part of the deal is that the town gets to pick the architect and the workers. So the town and the county authorities notice right away that this is a gift, money's fungible, Washington's gift spares them the cost of paying for this. Whatever money they have, it's Depression time, maybe they can use elsewhere. The town feels empowered. So you see. Now on the other end, PWA regional offices then send bids to structures back to a national office. Ickes reviews them. Every week with a manila envelope, Ickes goes to the White House, and Roosevelt looks over his projects personally, just to say you look over, and he looked over his stamp collection. And this gives Ickes a guaranteed weekly audience with the president. That special thing, even then very special, access, right? Access. And the most important part of it all is the scale of the spending. The PWA spends $3 billion in its first few years, or now half the size of the federal budget. What had seemed an impossible, even spending $3 billion, quickly becomes an everyday number. And we're having that phenomenon now too. So it started out 3.3 billion, 3.3 billion, and then they started to call it just the 3.3, and then just the 3.3, the 3.3 project. I'm going to read you something Ickes said from his diary because it's it captures it all. It helped me to estimate its size by figuring if we had it all in currency and should load it into trucks, we could set out with it from Washington, D.C. for the Pacific coast, shovel off 1 million at every milepost, and at the end still have enough left to build a fleet of battleships. And as the biographer notes, somewhere on these buildings, usually there were the words, Harold L. Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, right? So I think it's hard for us to imagine this high that they were experiencing. They went up and down the East Coast in these special trains with the president. They crossed the country in special cars, and Ickes is writing in his diary about this. The cars have something he calls cooled air. For people like Ickes, going to the Capitol really does mean a chance to reshape the country. People called him the Pharaoh, and in fact, this arrangement does make him kind of like a pharaoh, simultaneously grand and petty. You know, the party that's in power will punish the party that's out of power. And the greatest instance of Ickes' pettiness involves Herbert Hoover, the out-of-power predecessor of FDR. You probably know, some of you very well, the story of the Hoover Dam, already well under construction. Finishing up, the dam is named after Hoover because Hoover, while he was still Commerce Secretary, very carefully brokered the complex arrangements among the states that allowed the dam's construction. What's more, there's a big precedent for naming dams after presidents. There's even a Coolidge Dam. So Hoover is pretty sure this is going to be the Hoover Dam, his legacy. But Ickes personally insists on changing the name to Boulder Dam. And then he kind of adds insult to injury by not acknowledging what he's done. In his diary, Ickes complains, I like this too, a number of insulting letters, some anonymous, have been attacking me for changing the name of Hoover Dam to Boulder Dam. I have always called this Boulder Dam myself, as do many in Washington, and I have continued that usage. I consider it very unfair to call it Hoover Dam. Meanwhile, of course, they're inaugurating a duel of the dams. Grand Coulee Dam, new dam, is only 335 feet high, half Hoover Dam, but at 3,400 feet long across. It's triple the length of Hoover Dam. Infrastructure competition. I think it's to, and I would mention this because there are many Republicans in this audience, it's to Hoover's credit, so discredited was he at this point, remember the early 30s, that he still threatened Ickes. In 1934, Hoover writes a piece, Saturday Evening Post, on the New Deal. He calls it a plea for liberty. Ickes gets furious and writes a nasty letter saying that Hoover's liberty is the liberty of the exploiter. Liberty of privilege is what they want, Ickes said. They don't want to let go of anything they had. But the important thing about this infrastructure story is it's big. Ickes gets away with his talk, his nastiness, his pettiness, because he's effective in his job. He's ferociously organized, ferociously committed to the PWA project. How many counties in the United States? 3,000? Like that? All but 33 of them is getting a PWA project. So you see them. Yeah. Some people, and when I give you all the talk about the PWA, it's because you want to listen to who it cuts out. You hear the word county in the transaction, you hear the word region, you hear town, you hear Roosevelt and Ickes, but you do not hear the word state. Some people are complaining about the architecture of these projects. A New Yorker critic, Frederick Guttheim, would later write in the end of the 30s and comment on the PWA that it has produced not one architectural masterpiece. But that, in a way, is the point. Roosevelt knows masterpieces are dangerous. They're not what's needed. On the contrary, a masterpiece from Washington might stand out too much. In Indiana, this is the task of ingratiation. The goal is to make the towns feel the buildings are theirs, to get people used to Washington's hand being in projects that were historically entirely local. I'll read you another quote. No skyscrapers, a park around every project. He thought it especially important that the architecture be regional. There ought not be a single stereotype federal building, one advisor wrote of Roosevelt's PWA. And people like these buildings. We like these buildings. We know them. You could almost put it biblically, America looked upon the PWA and saw that it was good. Once you see how the symbol worked, you can review the following 18 months of this election, and you see what it is, a series of successive attempts to give to various groups of X's. The laws that we know, the Social Security for the senior citizens, the Wagner Act, what it gave labor, the Public Utilities Law, what it gave to public utilities at the expense of private utilities. Littler projects, another big one, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, not PWA. All these laws passed really fast, in great haste, many over the summer in a largely still un-air-conditioned Washington. The WPA is worth our time because it was also a big spending project. I went to Michigan and looked a little bit at the material from Senator Arthur Vandenberg. Vandenberg was so aghast at the scale of the spending on that he speaks to you at double the length Newt and I speak today, saying, I see before me 4 or 5 billion worth of lost liberty. The WPA, he says, is the largest single appropriation ever made in the history of the world. And he's probably right, and we're going to say that again this year about another appropriation. They created Federal Theater Project, art is part of it, Federal Writer Project, Historical Records Survey, and some of that work will be familiar to you. Additional advertising, you'll be familiar maybe with the humble, high-quality guidebooks, WPA guidebooks to the towns, states, regions. I'm from Illinois. I have one such guidebook for Starved Rock State Park. These guidebooks are another way of making federal expansion seem less threatening. Just like the architecture, these guidebooks say, here's a new definition of the relationships in federalism. We will respect local history, we will respect local custom, we will respect your folklore and honor it. Artists in America have a lot less work than usual. You remember the unemployment number. These are our children and they are unemployed, watching from the parent point of view. It's hard to overestimate how welcome the federal subsidy was that they gave to artists at this time. Newsmen, photographers, sculptors are all going on Washington's payroll. This is like having Google or AOL staffers after our crash go to work for President-elect Obama or Senator Levin or President Bush before or Speaker Pelosi or Senator Reid. And there are also yet other parts of government doing direct propaganda. One is called the Resettlement Administration. I talk a lot about it in the Forgotten Man book. The head is a guy named Rex Tugwell. Tugwell worked very hard on resettlement. One of his aims is to sustain agriculture. He's from an ag family, and to prove it is worth sustaining. He also devotes resources to documenting his work. He hires a photographer team to show. These photographers document the poverty of migrants, the need for the program. Among them is the great talent Dorothea Lange, which is how we get the most famous image of the Great Depression that I showed you before. Migrant mother, picture from the California fields.